The world as we knew it after the Cold War, well, that's over. As we look towards 2026, things are in a profound state of reorganization. Crises are overlapping, and shocks are moving so fast that diplomacy just can't keep up. In this explainer, we're going to break down the complex forces that are shaping this brand new and pretty unstable world.
So where do we even begin? Let's start with a crisis from 2025 that brought two nuclear-armed neighbors right to the absolute edge of war. This story, it really reveals the new rules of the game, this new kind of brinkmanship in the fragile world we're all living in.
Just look at how quickly this all spiraled out of control. It all kicked off on April 22nd with a devastating terrorist attack. Now, that was the spark, but the real accelerant, that came when India responded by suspending the Indus Waters Treaty. That led directly to 4 straight days of intense military exchanges. We're talking missiles and drones from both sides. It took some frantic back-channel diplomacy from the US, China, and the Gulf states to just barely pull them back from the brink with a ceasefire on May 10th.
And this right here, this is the crucial point. For decades, that Indus Waters Treaty was considered sacred. It held up even through previous wars. So by weaponizing water, India crossed a huge psychological line. It sent a signal that, in this new era, even long-standing agreements designed to build trust are now on the table as just another tool for leverage. Pakistan immediately declared that any threat to its water supply would be seen as an act of war, which just shows you how razor-thin the margin for error has become.
So you might be thinking, okay, that's one really scary situation. But here's the thing, this high-stakes brinksmanship isn't unique to South Asia, not at all. In fact, it's part of a global pattern, and it's becoming a defining feature of modern great power competition.
To really get what's going on, you have to understand this concept of deterrence theater. Think back to that India-Pakistan crisis. When both nations put their nuclear forces on high alert, were they actually about to launch? Probably not. It was a performance. It was a message sent with very real, very dangerous weapons, all to gain leverage. It's a dangerous game of signaling, and it's being played right now in multiple hotspots around the globe.
We're seeing this exact same logic play out all over the world. In Venezuela, Russia is threatening to place hypersonic missiles, which sounds a whole lot like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? All to pressure the US. Over in Taiwan, the US is providing its own hypersonic systems to try and deter a Chinese invasion. And of course, in Ukraine, the war of attrition grinds on, with military aid and battlefield pressure being used like bargaining chips. In every one of these cases, missiles and military posturing are no longer just weapons. They're arguments in a very high-stakes negotiation.
You know, this represents a fundamental shift in thinking. During the Cold War, escalation was like this ladder that everyone was terrified to even put a foot on. The whole goal was to avoid climbing it. But now the great powers are intentionally taking steps up that ladder. They're using this calibrated, controlled escalation as a primary tool to create pressure and force the other side's hand.
So are these just a few isolated flare-ups, or are they all symptoms of a much bigger, more systemic problem? You really have to ask yourself, are we actually living in a more dangerous world?
Well, when you look at the actual data, the answer is startling. And frankly, it's pretty sobering.
According to the highly respected Uppsala Conflict Data Program, in 2024, the world saw 61 state-based armed conflicts. 61. Just let that number sink in for a minute. That is the highest number of active conflicts in a single year since the end of the Second World War. It's even higher than the peaks we saw during the Cold War.
And this isn't just concentrated in one region. It's a global phenomenon. Africa is currently the world's most conflict-dense continent. It's home to nearly half of these wars, but Asia and the Middle East are not far behind. This is a systemic issue. It's a world that is quite literally on fire.
So what's the root cause of this explosion in violence? It's this fundamental shift in global power. We've moved from a unipolar world dominated by the US to a multipolar one, where powers like China, Russia, and regional players like Iran and Turkey are all pursuing their own interests. The problem is, the global institutions meant to manage this, like the UN Security Council, were built for a completely different era, and now they're basically paralyzed. It leaves this new, more chaotic world dangerously unmanaged.
But the defining feature of this new era isn't just the sheer number of crises. It's the way these crises now connect to each other, amplify each other, and compound each other in ways we just haven't seen before.
For instance, think about how economic competition is no longer in its own separate box. The intense US-China rivalry over tariffs and export controls now directly fuels military tensions and fears of confrontation in hotspots like the Taiwan Strait.
At the same time, climate change is no longer just an environmental issue. It's a direct conflict multiplier. I mean, think back to that India-Pakistan crisis. The weaponization of water resources is a perfect and terrifying example of how climate stress is now fueling geopolitical instability.
And finally, there's the race for dominance in future-defining technologies like artificial intelligence and advanced semiconductors. That's literally breaking the global economy apart, creating competing tech and economic blocks that are centered around the US and China.
So what this creates is a whole new geometry of risk. It's a world where military power is often performative, like we saw with deterrence theater. The old rules of deterrence are breaking down. A crisis in one part of the world can create shocks that ripple globally in an instant. And the institutions that were designed to help, they're simply unable to keep up.
So what does this all mean? How should governments, businesses, and frankly, how should all of us think about navigating a world that's become so much more complex and unpredictable?
This quote, I think, captures the most important takeaway perfectly. This isn't about doomsday scenarios. The world is not ending. It is, however, going through a fundamental and often violent reorganization. The core challenge isn't to fear this change, but to adapt to it, because ignoring this new reality is a fast track to irrelevance.
In this kind of environment, the core strategy has to shift. It's no longer about predicting the next crisis. That's a fool's errand. It's about building resilience. That means doing things like diversifying supply chains so they can withstand shocks, strengthening cyber defenses, planning for multiple different futures, and keeping diplomatic channels open, even with your adversaries.
This leaves us with a final crucial question. For decades, we tried to build a world based on prediction and stability. But in the fragmented world of 2026, maybe the most vital skill isn't having all the answers, but having the resilience to withstand the questions.